Good evening, everyone. My name is Charles Royer, Director of the Institute of Politics, and welcome to our forum this evening, Republican versus Democratic Strategies in Targeting Diverse Voters, a case study of the Latino community. The forum this evening is co-sponsored by the Harvard Journal of Hispanic Policy, the Kennedy School of Government Hispanic Caucus, Alianza from the Harvard Law School, the Institute of Politics Student Advisory Committee. And my congratulations to those of you who worked so hard to make this forum happen. They're always complex and difficult to pull off, and Alma and Carrie and all of you who worked on this, thank you very much. What we will do tonight is first introduce our guests, and then we will have presentations from the panelists followed by some dialogue among the panel, and then certainly, as always, in the spirit of the forum with all of you. And we appreciate your being here to help us carry on the conversation. On my immediate right is Maria Echiveste. Now take it easy, because she's the Deputy Personnel Director for the White House, and all these policy wonks out here are just loving the fact that you are here, and they're all
have half the resume. Sure.
They're all looking for work, and they're all looking at you. And she is the Associate Director of the White House Presidential Personnel Office. She was National Latino Coordinator and Deputy Policy Director for the Clinton campaign. She was Deputy Personnel Director for the transition. She's a lawyer, has been a member of the Democratic National Committee, worked with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and has been in private practice as an attorney. On her right is Jim Weber, a former newspaper editor from Minnesota. He's a Republican political consultant. He is a partner of Institute of Politics fellow Frank Luntz, who was unable to be with us tonight, and we appreciate Jim stepping in to fill that spot. He was the political director for the 1988 Jack Kemp presidential campaign. In 1986, he was Southern Regional Political Director for the National Republican Congressional Campaign Committee. He was Chief of Staff to Senator John McCain of Arizona. On my immediate left is Dr. Dario Moreno, who is a consultant, a professor of political science at Florida International University. His research is in the area of Latin American politics. He's published numerous articles and books regarding Cuban and Cuban American politics. He was part of the 1992 Florida reapportionment case that established 3 African American and 2 Hispanic majority districts in Florida. He's working with the Cuban American Caucus now to redraw the districts for the Florida State House and the Senate. And next to Dr. Moreno is a very familiar face around the Kennedy School, whom we're very pleased to welcome back, Dr. Rodolfo de la Garza. We call him Rudy, who is the director of the 1992 election project, which research we'll hear about tonight. Dr. de la Garza is the Mike Hogue Professor of Community Affairs, University of Texas at Austin. He's an expert on ethnic politics, and in particular the political mobilization of Mexican Americans and other Latino communities. He's written on the Latino politics in the 1988 elections, and he was just supervised a Latino National Political Survey, which is a project of several universities funded by Ford, Rockefeller, and the Spencer and Tinker Foundations, a significant piece of political research on the Latino communities in the country. With that, let me begin by asking our 2 representatives of the political parties to begin with some big picture ideas of where they see their party headed with regard to targeting the diversity in the country, with in particular the Latino community, and to talk some about how in the 1992 elections these strategies were carried out, what strategies there were, what were the political goals, particularly with regard to the Latino community of the Republican and Democratic Party. And let's start with Ms. Echiveste.
Good evening. I want to thank everyone for inviting me up here. Some of you may know I got in just a few minutes ago. It is rather hectic in the White House on all sorts of fronts, including the fact that we're still trying to staff government. It seems that it takes each new administration longer, so with the criticism we've been receiving, I'm being told, is not unusual, but nonetheless it makes us very tense. I'd like to start off by doing reverse order, which is what was the strategy in '92 and where are the Democrats, I think, may go in the next 4 years. Obviously, I'm sort of looking at it from presidential politics and looking, all of the 94 elections are going to be important. For those of us now in D.C., the 96 elections are critical. There has been, I think many of you would probably agree, a sense that what the Democrats did and how Bill Clinton put together a campaign that resulted in victory was a de-emphasis on ethnic outreach and racial outreach. And looking at it at this vantage point, the answer has to be yes, that was in fact a very conscious decision in terms of overall strategy for winning. The fact is that in order to win the White House, you had to get the traditional Democratic voters, i.e. labor, minorities. But you also had to get a certain percentage of those Reagan Democrats who had abandoned the party in '80. And in order to do that, you had to fashion an approach that would speak to the needs and issues of the suburban and essentially white, although I want to come back to that, voter. And it's just plain politics. You look at numbers and how are you going to win the election. The fact is that the issues that people talk about and what Bill Clinton talked about cut across racial and ethnic lines. And if you really look at what the president or what the candidate was saying during that year, he was talking about issues that affected not only the suburban voter, but also the urban environments and Latinos as well. But you needed to, it was a delicate balancing act. And it is one that I think we successfully, or at least for the moment, have walked, because we raised expectations out there in the Latino community in particular, as well as all other communities. The fact is that the president promised that his administration, not only on policy issues, but also on personnel issues, would have an administration that looked like America. And so people expect those promises to be kept. And in many ways, that the issues that he talked about, which were health care, the economy, job training, education, were ones that are very important to the Hispanic community. And so people were willing, I think, to some degree, accept the fact that they weren't getting as much of the candidate's time and as much of the resources, campaign resources. So that was the overall look at strategy, which was how do you keep the traditional base solidly in line and yet go after that other voter. The problem that you had with '92, and is one that we have to give serious attention to for '96, is that you had a three-way race. And when you look at the overall vote that the president got, I would probably say, and I think many would agree, what you ended up getting was to a great extent the traditional Democratic vote. So in some ways I would say people, the traditional labor, the African American community, the Hispanic community could say to the president, excuse me, we helped you get elected, and you must respond to our concerns, because the fact is that Perot got a significant percentage point. That Perot voter is critical for 96. There's no assurance there'll be a third candidate. So I think that the strategy that was used in 92 will in fact be very similar, or some variation on that theme is going to be important to 96. But how did that actually get played out? There was, as an Hispanic coordinator on the campaign, it was my job to reach out to leadership around the country to get them to start listening to this candidate, what the issues, to get the kind of support. And it was a constant battle, because what Latinos in particular distrust about the Democratic Party is that it only comes around 4 years, every 4 years, and it doesn't support candidates, Latino candidates, or at least not to the degree that we in the Hispanic community would say ought to be supported. And so not only was it hard to sell, in essence, a candidate a small state governor where there were no Hispanics essentially in his state, you also had the problem that for the Democratic Party, there was a suspicion, why should we get behind a Democratic candidate? Nothing ever changes. And so it was a doubly hard sell. That skepticism is, I think, on the line these next 4 years. And whether the president, one of the things that I kept hearing was, the candidate is not talking about Latino issues. He's not talking specifically to Latinos. And I would throw back, and I think it's something that we should consider, is, well, what are Latino issues? Is it that he has to say some Spanish words? Is it that he has to be speaking primarily to an Hispanic audience? Does he have to, what are Hispanic issues? Because indeed the issues that he ran on were ones that affect our community, except in greater percentage. Anything, take healthcare, major task force, a major project of this administration. The results of that policy development are going to affect our community much more than other communities, because somewhere between 35% and 38% of our community does not have health insurance at all. So maybe he wasn't talking about health insurance for Hispanics specifically, but the policy direction is one that's going to benefit our community. So I think that on a policy level, what happens in the next 4 years is going to be important. But the thing that our community, based on my 1.5 year experience, keeps looking at is, well, where are the Hispanics in appointments? There is this sense, unless you have the appointments, then there isn't a Latino perspective or input into policy development. And so again, what happens in the next 4 years is critical, I believe, to where the Latino community is going to be in its relationship to the Democratic Party in 96. And I, for one, would think that it would be very difficult to go out and campaign in 96 if we don't have, as an administration, certain things, a record that we can run on that says we paid attention to issues that were of concern to the Latino, and recognize those concerns. Lastly, I just want to say that if you step aside, sort of step back, there is a danger in this country, I think, of becoming balkanized. And by that I mean, you get to the point where you look at politics as totally where, each community, and I see this particularly in the Hispanic community, when we get lobbied, where are the Cuban appointments? Where are the Puerto Rican appointments? Where are the Central American appointments? There are too many Mexican Americans being appointed. It becomes difficult to bring progress if we focus sometimes, and then it's not just the Hispanic community, it's the African American community, it's the Caribbean community in New York, which is where I lived before the campaign. There's a real tension between African Americans and Haitians and others from the from the Caribbean. And so this is, I think, a danger that bears thinking about. If you're really a country, if you're, and recognizing the diversity should not be a mechanism for splintering. It ought to be something to bring us together. And I think that what the president ran on is that notion that, in fact, we can recognize and be respectful of all of our differences, but if we pay too much attention to those differences, we may, in fact, not work together as a country. And so I leave that as a possible, something that needs to be thought, since you're here thinking, you need to be thought about as to where that leads us. So, thank you.
Thank you. Jim.
Well, thank you. This is rather short notice for me, so I'm going to refer to some scribblings that I did on the airplane on the not so long trip up here. I feel a little bit at a disadvantage here, talking about outreach and representing the Republican Party and President Bush, who I did not support in 1988, and while I voted for him in 1992, I tried to get my friend Jack Kemp to run against him, but he chose not to. Really, to begin with, let me tell you that while I am a Republican consultant, what I really am is I'm a Republican conservative consultant. I very much believe that the energy in our party and the energy to pull diverse groups together in this country, from my perspective, rests with a new energy that's developing in the Republican Party among conservatives, guys like Kemp and Bennett and people like that. And I can tell you that, getting to the point, I don't think there can be any conclusion regarding the outreach the Republican Party or the Bush campaign put forward in this last election, other than to conclude that there really wasn't anything. I wasn't involved with the campaign itself. I was doing other races at other levels, state levels and congressional level. And what I can tell you is that in my interface with the Bush campaign and my interface with the Republican National Committee at that time, there really wasn't any consideration that was given to reaching out to Hispanics or to blacks or minorities. Mainly, they were concerned about how do we fight off the inevitable abortion attacks. How are we doing on the economic issues? Are we holding our base together? Are those Reagan Democrats that you spoke about staying with us? The Bush campaign, I think, in a few cases, probably produced some fairly generically worded Spanish language radio or television ads, but really beyond that, I don't think that there was anything really meaningful getting out into that community, and that's a problem for Republicans and has been for a long time. But the question has to be asked: why did Bush not apply the same level of methodology in targeting to non-whites that we typically and regularly do in the Republican Party to the white voting population? We know, for example, those of us who are in the business, that there are real targetable differences that exist between groups, within groups, in all sectors of our society, economically and racially. We use it all the time. Part of my business is direct mail. We use it all the time in direct mail. It's highly targeted. We ask for money from people. We know why we ask them for money. We know what they respond to and what they don't respond to. So why didn't Bush do that? Why did he throw in the towel? Why did he lose nearly 1 in 5? I guess 1 in 5 Cubans in Florida when that group had been a solid block for Republican candidates in the past. We know that these people, particularly Latinos, hold conservative social issues, social values. They're family-oriented, and on that point, they're in agreement with the Republican Party. But what you saw in this last campaign was, of course, George Bush's unwillingness to talk about a lot of things that revolved around traditional family values. By the time the campaign rolled around, of course, Dan Quayle and all his little problems had made the whole idea of talking about traditional values or family values something that Republican candidates were being counseled to run away from. But the reason I think that we have difficulty in outreach and actually garnering good levels of support from these groups is simply because they display positions on economic issues that are dominant within the income and economic levels where they fall. They're no different, in fact, I don't believe, than white Americans at the same economic levels. And we have trouble attracting votes from a lot of white Americans at some lower income levels. So what should we expect, and what do we have to do to earn some support in the years to come? And I'm abbreviating this, and I'm moving along because I know we're on a short timeline here. First, I think it's important to understand that many GOP candidates do not cultivate non-white voters or low-income voters because they've become convinced that success among those groups simply isn't in the cards, and it's not possible for them. It becomes a cost-benefit analysis. You have limited resources in the campaign. So what you do is you do what you think you can, but you don't go a great deal beyond that because you know you have to roll up a big vote among your own constituencies and try and get through the hoop that way. But the problem with that, from my perspective, is our own propensity to continue that pattern will only work against our own long-term interests as these groups and as these individuals become more assimilated into mainstream America. They just become American voting population. If we allow near-term economic concerns to take precedence over longer-term wealth accumulation, and if we fail to leverage areas of agreement, which are social issues in particular, then we cannot reasonably hope to garner support from these voters, in my opinion. So what, if any, is the prescription for Republican or conservative gains in these communities, and how can we go about doing it? There are 4 points that I kind of think are important, and we can't solve the problems of the planet in 5 minutes, but let me go through them real quickly. First, it is not to do, as some in our party have suggested, and avoid or even run from discussion of social issues. Even as the Clinton administration is putting together its economic plan, which I believe to be a very aggressive expansion of government in the form of a liberal social agenda, I believe pressing values, needs of families aren't being met in a way that's going to satisfy them over the long term. If you forget abortion for a moment, the conservative social agenda, including educational improvement through choice, reform of assistance programs to encourage families to remain intact, the teaching of traditional values as a firewall against the spread of violent crime and drug use, and the improvement of local communities, or empowerment of local communities to better assume personal security, offer powerful magnets for future votes in these and any communities. Second, I think that we as a party have to recognize the real and significant differences that exist between groups within these broad communities. In short, we have to stop the campaign of tokenism that we see so often from the Republicans, and we have to target audiences with economic and social messages which offer real reasons to support Republican candidates. Third, we have to recognize that the inherently long-term economic thesis that's held by many conservatives, focusing on growth, does not adequately address the immediate pain being experienced by some people. Aggressive pro-growth policies can and do create real long-term opportunity, which, as Ronald Reagan began to prove, can and does attract broad support. The problem that we've experienced in the Republican Party, there are those of us, myself among them, who believe that only the Bush administration's loss of public confidence through really the utter neglect of domestic economic policy prevented the partisan realignment that people were flirting with during the 1980s from becoming much more of a permanent fixture in American politics. And fourth, we have to understand that while most Americans do prefer less government, this does not necessarily convey a license to ignore real need. Our movement can only succeed if we offer a workable path to prosperity, which can be tolerated by those who will most benefit from it, should it succeed. Finally, let me say that I believe that the real potential to attract support from Latinos, whatever specific part of that group they may come from, rests not with the mainstream Republicans or even with the traditional wing of the conservative movement. It rests with the emerging new conservative movement, which prioritizes progress and growth through new ideas and risk-taking over rigid adherence to some creed of ideological purity. We will fight passionately for smaller and less intrusive government. We will fight passionately for less burdensome government. But we won't do it because government is inherently bad. We'll do it because it cannot possibly, in our view, fulfill the economic and spiritual needs of a nation as broad as ours. Only communities free to prosper and willing to take risks can possibly do that.
Thank you, Jim. Now let's move to the preliminary findings of the research on the 1992 elections, and we'll begin with Dario.
I'm going to do something a little different than I guess anybody else in the panel, and I'm going to talk about a specific case. And I guess here at the Kennedy School, case studies is not illegal. And if you look at the numbers from the 1992 elections in Dade County and in Florida, the Hispanic vote didn't look very different from what it looked in other elections. Bill Clinton ran about 7% better than Michael Dukakis. He carried 22% of the Hispanic precincts as compared to 15% that Michael Dukakis did. The Cuban American community still showed a close alliance with the Republican Party. Another Cuban Republican, Lincoln Diaz-Balart, was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Through the redistricting process, Cuban Americans picked up 2 additional seats in the Florida State House. But I think when people look back at the 1992 elections, the 1992 elections are going to be viewed as a watershed in Dade County politics for 2 reasons. One, the 1992 elections, thanks to the efforts of the Clinton campaign, broadened the political dialogue in Dade County. Bill Clinton was the first Democratic presidential candidate to seriously campaign in the Cuban American community in Dade County. He made various trips into Dade County as strategic points in the campaign. And he made support for Democratic candidates respectable among Cuban Americans. And second, the 1992 campaign, I think, highlights the rapid political empowerment of the Miami Cuban community. The Cuban community in Miami has now holds the balance of power, for example, in the Florida State Senate, which is split 20-20, and the 3 Cuban Republicans in the State Senate have often voted with the Democratic Party on education, health, and other issues. Why did these changes occur? Why did Cubans play a larger role in the 1992 campaign than their numbers warrant? After all, there are probably something like 300,000 Cuban American voters in Florida. Why did they attract so much attention? And I think there were 3 reasons. First, Florida was a competitive state for the first time since the 1980 election, and the Democrats had an excellent chance of carrying it. Bush carried Florida in 1988 by 1 million votes. In 1992, he carried it by 85,000 votes. So that shows the dramatic change in Florida politics and the erosion of Bush's support. So Clinton's strategy in Florida was not necessarily to win the state, but to keep Bush pinned down in what was one of his bases of support. And so what better symbol of a candidate basically running a national campaign, running everywhere across the country, than Bill Clinton going to the very heart of Little Havana, Versailles Restaurant, and supporting the Torricelli bill. One political pundit described it as, in-your-face campaigning, right? On the other hand, for Bush, Florida was a vital state. There was no way Bush could win re-elections if he didn't carry Florida. So for both candidates, Florida took on an importance. And when you look at the political map of Florida, and if you're a Democrat and you want to win statewide office, one of the things you might want to do is reduce the high level of Cuban support for the GOP. Cuban Americans have probably been the singular most loyal group to Republican candidates than any other discernible groups. They supported Ronald Reagan in 1984, 88 to 12% They supported George Bush 85-15 in 1988. If you do a regression analysis of some of the Cuban precincts in Little Havana, you have 100% Cuban votes for Republican candidates. So, for Bill Clinton, the Cuban community was an important community to reduce Republican loyalty in. Moreover, there were rumblings in the Cuban community of dissatisfaction with George Bush. Some of the things that affected him with groups throughout the nation. And there were some areas of dissatisfaction included economics. The Dade County economy suffered a major recession in the late 1980s. Two large Miami-based airlines, or with large operations in Miami, Eastern and Pan Am, went bankrupt. So there was economic dissatisfaction. There was dissatisfaction also because it was reported in 1992 that the State Department was warning the Cuban government of filibuster raids by the Cuban community in Miami against the island. And the idea that the U.S. State Department was informing the Castro regime of Cuban exile raids against Cuba caused a major scandal among Miami Cubans. And third reason for Cuban dissatisfaction with the Bush administration was Bush's lack of support for the Cuban Democracy Act, or the Torricelli Bill, which tightened the U.S. boycott against Cuba. So, so the Bill Clinton supported the Torricelli Bill a month before George Bush, and that gave him an entree into the Cuban community. The third reason that the Cubans played a larger role in the campaign than the numbers warranted was that the Cuban political agenda is basically non-controversial. Unlike other minority groups, unlike Chicanos, Afro-Americans, the Cubans aren't calling for a redistribution policy. They're calling for something that, for most Americans, is exceedingly non-controversial, and that is a hard line against Fidel Castro. Either campaign, George Bush or Bill Clinton can give that to the Cuban community without suffering an Anglo backlash. So, in other words, what the Cubans were asking was something very easily delivered by either campaign. Now, if Bill Clinton ran such a brilliant campaign in the Cuban community, why did he only get 22% of the votes? And I think and I'll end with this, and I think there are basically two reasons. One is the issue of trust. Cuban Americans still don't trust the Democratic Party to do the right thing with the Castro regime, or what they perceive to be the right thing. Cuban Americans still remember the Bay of Pigs, and still remember the controversial Carter dialogue with the Castro regime. So that historic memory still has resonance in the Cuban community. And the second, and I think more important reason, is the Dade County Democratic Party has been a disaster in appealing to Cuban Americans at a local level. There are no Cuban Democrats in the state assembly or in the state senate. The only declared Democrat elected to public office is a county commissioner, Alex Pinellas. And the Democratic Party has done a dreadful job of recruiting Cuban Democrats to run for public office. In a state Senate district created to elect a Latino, the Democratic Party ran an Anglo-Democrat, Kendall Coffey. In 3 state assembly districts created to elect Latinos, the Democrats came up with Anglo candidates. The only Hispanic Democrat that ran in the general election in Dade County in 1992 was Magna Davis, who ran on a very popular platform of lifting the embargo and allowing travel to Cuba. She lost in the Cuban precinct 6-1. So, and Magna Davis' campaign proved, I think, a drag on the Clinton numbers, because it gave Cuban Republicans could point to her and say, this is the real Democratic position on Cuba, not the Bill Clinton position. So, at this I am.
Thank you. Rudy?
Well, it's good to be here again. It doesn't feel like home, but it's nice to be back. I'm also pleased that this panel is what I think is beginning to be a realization that to study Latino politics is not anything other than to study American politics, that you cannot understand Latino politics but within the context of American politics. And too long, the study of American politics has excluded Latinos. So by incorporating Latinos, we're not looking at Latinos, but rather looking at Latinos within the American polity. And so congratulations to the students who put this together. It's a very good thing. Let me give you, I want to do a couple of things, describe some overall findings very loosely, and then more than that, give you some interpretations of the findings. And as I talk about this, you've got to keep a couple of things in mind. One is, whenever you try to assess the Latino vote and Latinos' impact on elections, you've got to begin with demographics. The most important thing about the Latino demographics is, with the exception of Cubans on almost all of the accounts, Latinos are young, they are poor, they are non-citizens. There the Cubans fit in. 40% of Latinos are non-citizens of the adults. Now, that's a backdrop. So whenever you look at Latino numbers, crank those in, because each of those categories reduces voting. To have an impact on elections, for Latinos to have an impact, the elections have to be competitive. Latinos must vote cohesively, and they have to turn out. If any one of those 3 things is absent, the Latino vote is irrelevant. Okay? So what happens in 1992? Well, I guess I'm going to break this up into three kinds of findings. Some new patterns, some old ones, and some ironies and contradictions. Let me begin with the old ones. First of all, overall, the Latino vote was irrelevant to the electoral outcome. Now you recall, in the 1980s, everybody was saying this would be the decade of the Hispanics. Well, the decade came and went, and people kept talking about that. And the rhetoric went down, essentially. It became more realistic. People didn't quite say it was going to be the decade of the Hispanics, but they were hoping it might be. But I think one can say the following: if no Latinos had voted, Bush would still have lost, Clinton would still have won. Perhaps there might have been a few switches. I think it reasonable that if Latinos hadn't voted, Clinton would have taken Florida. If Latinos hadn't voted, New Mexico and Colorado might have gone Republican. Perhaps. At least New Mexico would have gone Republican. We're not sure about Colorado. So that overall we can say, best evidence right now, Latinos influenced Florida, but it didn't matter. And Latinos influenced New Mexico for sure, and that was nice but unnecessary. Okay? Now, I'm talking it nationally. Now, I can be more positive at other levels, but let me go on here. A second continued pattern. There was a continued increase in Latino representation in both the Democratic and Republican conventions. This is quite impressive, actually. Now, for the Democrats, this is predictable because the Democratic Party has quotas, in effect. You have to have so many people in, and the Democrats are now meeting their quotas. So there's a lot of Latinos, not only as delegates, but as important members of various party convention committees, including the platform, etc. Latinos were present, and they were substantively present. The Republicans don't have quotas. Interestingly, however, given the number of Latino Republicans, Latinos had a higher representation at the Republican convention than they did at the Democratic convention, controlling for the number of Latino Republicans. So that there is either an active outreach or an affinity, an innate affinity, as was suggested by Mr. Weber. I want to go back to that in just a second. I'm not sure I would call it an innate affinity, but perhaps. Anyway, there's now, when I was growing up, something that didn't exist, Mexican Republicans. It used to be an oxymoron. It seems to be real. Okay? A third point is the continued decline in Democratic support among Latinos. This is, I think, quite interesting. President Clinton received the lowest percentage of Latino votes of any president since we've been keeping count. Democratic president since we've been keeping count. That's surprising, especially since you had a higher Latino turnout this time. It goes up 9%. Clinton gets, depending on how you count, 60-some% of the vote. That's lower by far than any other Democratic candidate since we've been keeping count. Conversely, there is a continued increase in the non-Democratic vote. In this case, we've got to include Perot. Between Perot and Bush, you got perhaps, you got close to 40% of the vote. If Republicans win 40% of the Latino vote, they'll never lose an election in the West. Okay? But it wasn't just a Republican vote. It also was a Perot vote. Another old repeated theme is continued low turnout relative to other electorates. So those are some old themes. Now let me give you some new ones quickly. Maria mentioned this already, and it's important. I think it's very, very important. And we talked about this with the students earlier. The de-emphasizing of ethnic appeals. This was a conscious effort, culminating in the words of one senior Clinton operative in the Jesse Jackson Sister Souljah speech. A senior Clinton operative defined that as the crystallizing moment of the campaign. In that moment, President Clinton's people made it clear they were not going to make an ethnic appeal. Now, it did a couple of things, in my judgment. It slapped Jesse Jackson on the hand and told him to understand what his place was. It legitimized the more moderate, centrist, Democratic black officials, and it reduced any anxiety, or a lot of the anxiety, among white voters. It served three purposes very quickly, and I thought did it very effectively. Again, the phrase, the quote given to me, the crystallizing moment of the campaign. Second, in the Clinton campaign, Latinos, and other ethnics as well perhaps, played central non-ethnic roles in the campaign. I want to emphasize central non-ethnic roles. To a substantial degree, many of them came to the campaign without a history of Latino activism. Maria Echiveste, for example, was not a Latina activist. Other people did not have Latina or Latino credentials, yet they became prominent within the campaign. One person we spoke to, which was really marvelous, reflecting, I think, some of the kinds of thinking that may go on in this room. We asked this one person how she became involved in the campaign, a very dynamic, assertive young woman, and she said, well, I sort of wanted to work on a presidential campaign, and so I checked out how to do it, and I figured out it would be safe. And she said, I organized Youth for Clinton. This is a Mexicana from Texas, right? I organized Youth for Clinton. So she got involved and ended up being very important in the campaign on a totally non-ethnic dimension. Now, having asked her, was your ethnicity ever relevant or salient in the way you conducted yourself? After careful thought, she said no, no, no again. And yet, later in the campaign, we found an interesting correlation between the states where she was assigned to work and the proportion of Latinos in those states. Now, she did not put those two together, and she did not consciously act on that, but sort of happened. So perhaps either she's right or we're insightful. We don't know. Another interesting development is the Republicans, here contrary to what our colleague said a few minutes ago, had the more obviously ethnic campaign. They had a concentrated media campaign, Spanish language campaign. We told the Clinton people, and the Republicans already knew it, that the Mexicans who vote know English, so you don't have to reach them in Spanish. I don't know if that influenced Maria or not, but we told her that. Well, the Republicans still were using media in Spanish, and they had especially a very negative campaign message. And the only place where the Democrats responded in Spanish was in New Mexico to counter a very effective Spanish language negative campaign. Another point, and this is something that was talked about a few minutes ago, and I don't know how to conceptualize this. I'll use the lexicon out of Mexico, that is Mexico over there. There's the políticos and the técnicos, or los políticos y los dinosaurios, if you want, the técnicos, dinosaurios. In the American argot, we might call it the post-Chicano generation, or the chuppies, the Chicano yuppies, right? And what it is a young generation of whatever their own activist and ethnic commitments. It is, in my judgment, a generation for whom, this is the generation that is the beneficiaries of the Chicano movement. They are the ones who are now titled or educated and professionally certified, and who have as a cultural memory the discrimination, but not necessarily as a formative personal experience, thus lowering the edge, eliminating the chip, if you will. There's a cultural memory, but not a personal formative experience. That group was very different from what I call the dinosaurs, or maybe the Tyrannosaurus rex is a more kind of a real image, because this is the old Chicano movement types, who, and not only Chicano, but Puerto Rican and other groups as well, who really still had many of the Latino organizations. And they're very different. They're older, they're still scarred, they were formed in that other era, and they don't necessarily see things the same way. They approach politics differently. In my experience, in my judgment, the chuppy, and that's, I'm being unkind, really want to be dealt with as professionals. They may be completely ethnic in an identification, but they are also completely professional. And they don't necessarily want an ethnic responsibility. In 1978, I interviewed a then protege of Robert Strauss of the Democratic Party, who was working in the Carter White House. And he expressed this horrible feeling that they wouldn't let him, the White House and the Democratic Party, work on non-Latino issues. No matter what he tried to do, they kept making him a Mexican. And he was a Mexican, but he was really a political operative. And they wouldn't let him do it. And he left the White House finally. He said, and I want to be something more than a Mexican. I'm a Mexican at home. I don't have to be a Mexican on the job. Well, that was impossible in 1976, 77, 78, 79. That's now possible. And so a lot of these people are, in fact, bringing that to them. Again, I don't want to in any way disqualify an ethnic identification. What I want to do is emphasize the professional identification. That group differed very, very strongly in how they viewed politics. So it was the dinosaurios who pushed the old fight. Indeed, I'm told, and perhaps Maria may want to talk about this, by a variety of sources, that the Adelante con Clinton campaign, which gets developed, is pushed by the dinosaurs, not by the new group. The new group is already central to the campaign. They're already inside, holding key positions, and it's the outside dinosaurs who are saying, how come there's no ethnics in here? And they're talking to an ethnic, right? They're talking to a Mexican and say, how come there's no Mexicans, right? And the answer was, it's a new politics that they could not recognize. Now, another finding that's too complicated to go into here is the extent to which, for the Latino communities, the presidential election serves as a backdrop to other events, rather than a central event. Let me leave that. Let me go quickly to one irony in particular that I want to emphasize. Two very quickly. One is a schizophrenia in the Republican campaign. And this one really became explicit in the launching of the Viva Bush campaign in Austin, Texas. They launched the Viva Bush campaign in Austin, Texas, which is a terrible place to do that because there aren't many Mexicans in Austin, Texas. That's not where you want to do this. And so they brought in all typical Texas Republicans. And remember, Texas Republicans are very conservative. They wanted to make, they want to make English the official language. They're completely opposed to bilingual education, okay? And then they bring a few Mexicans to the meeting. So there's a few Mexicans and a whole lot of traditional Anglo-Texans. They introduce, you know, in really a touching way, Jeb Bush's son, George Bush Jr., in phrases that said, one of ours is in the White House. A Chicano said that, and I said, who the heck is that, right? And they introduced him, and he looks like Henry Cisneros. He has those, those handsome Indian features that people like to romanticize, right? And he stands up. But then Barbara Bush stands up, and remember the makeup of the audience that I've just given you, and she says, we want, I'm glad for all you Latinos, and she said, do you know what? She said, Clinton passed an official English bill, and we hate that. And you see the Chicanos going, cheering, and the Anglos not knowing what to say, right? And then there were two messages like that where they obviously didn't know who they were talking to, so they were appealing to Mexicans in an Anglo audience, and the Anglos are offended, and the Mexicans are cheering. It was a wonderful moment of cognitive dissonance. Let me emphasize then that my final point I would make is the irony. And here I wrote an editorial right before the election results came in on the assumption that Clinton was going to win. And the editorial said that ironically, the de-emphasis of ethnicity would probably benefit Latinos, because if Latinos held Clinton to his campaign to address the issues that he emphasized, they could hold him to the fire without making an ethnic claim. And they could win that way, as Americans rather than as an ethnic. So, with that.
Thank you, Rudy. One thing jumped out at me from that, among many things that jumped out of the presentation from this side of the table, was that the Latino vote was irrelevant in the election. Do you
I think
want to take a few minutes on that?
I have both a sort of emotional response. What is relevance? I mean, I'm glad we're all here at the JFK school, but if I think that when you say that the Latino vote is irrelevant, perhaps we look at it as we've been using the models that it only becomes important if it's in a swing vote, a swing state kind of thing. I would make it more basic, which is, why aren't we as a community valuing political participation, which in fact will result in greater accountability from our elected officials? So if we maybe what happened over these years was we tried to generate electoral support by saying your vote is really going to make a difference here, rather than saying your vote in every election is not only a responsibility, but is critical to getting our needs met. And my favorite example of why we just need to think about voting as something that should be ingrained in our youth and in our communities is, people always say, well, what about the Jewish community? 6 million strong, 5 million of them vote. That means something. And we're 20 million, 24 million, even if you assume, say, 40% are not citizens, that's a substantial number of votes. And we shouldn't be thinking about it as, was it relevant to Colorado and New Mexico? Sure, maybe in California was 18 points. I mean, I thought I was going to spend the last 2 months of the election fighting in California. I spent it in Colorado, New Mexico, and New Jersey. But, so that is troublesome. It's irrelevant if you look at it from the angle of, was it critical to the outcome? The fact of the matter is, every single community that votes, when you add it up, matters. I mean, that's very critical. So I would disagree with Rudy.
Well, while there's some discussion generating here on the panel, why don't we ask those of you who wish to ask a question or make a comment, go to the 2 microphones here on the floor, and we'll intersperse your questions and comments with the comments that still may exist on the panel here.
Can I just make one observation?
Sure.
The other thing that Rudy was talking about was the dinosaurs, dinosaurs. There is clearly, and I sort of ask you to think about this. There is clearly an attitude, and maybe it's 12 years, and maybe it's just the vestiges of our caudillo system, but the Latino community, Hispanic community, there is this tendency to look for, the Hispanic in the White House or the Hispanic in whatever agency, sort of looking for the power brokers or the gatekeepers. And one of the most frustrating things I think that those sort of community activists are having is that for the first time, there is not a special assistant to the president for Hispanic affairs. There just isn't. There's issue liaison, but there isn't ethnic politics. So not only did the campaign sort of de-emphasize ethnic politics, it's carried over into the administration. The key there is, how does the White House in and of itself become integrated, and how the administration? But for the first time, people are, I can't tell you the number of people who are saying, well, wait a minute, who do we call in the White House to deal with Hispanic affairs? Well, no, if you want to talk about this issue, you call this person. If you want to talk to this person, you talk to this other person. So it's a different administration, and that's it.
Well, I'm intrigued, if I could just throw this in, and maybe you could respond to this too, to what extent that reluctance to bestow ethnic responsibility on people in the White House is a kind of a sister soldier response to avoid scaring the majority community, and to what extent it's a new way of doing business in the White House.
Well, I was going to ask a question. There are rumors out there that, in fact, such a position was offered to a very prominent organizational leader from the Southwest in Texas. I don't want to go beyond that, but let me just say that those rumors are everywhere out there. You obviously don't want to talk about that.
No, I can tell you the rumors spread like wildfire around this country.
Does that mean that the rumor that I think we could, I was told,
I think it's false.
That position has not been offered?
No,
That's
the
interesting.
position's never been offered. The Office of Public Liaison, which is where traditionally you had has been totally restructured.
Okay, that's very good to know.
I do want to say something, because it's sort of the exception of Florida, I guess. One of the things that fall over of Cuban politics is, with the Bush administration, they played Jeb and his family as the in to the White House. The Clinton administration came back with Maria Arias.
Colorado and New Mexico, sure, maybe in California was 18 points. I thought I was going to spend the last 2 months of the election fighting in California. I spent it in Colorado, New Mexico, and New Jersey. But, so that is troublesome. It's irrelevant if you look at it from the angle of, was it critical to the outcome? The fact of the matter is, every single community that votes, when you add it up, matters. That's very critical. So I would disagree with Rudy.
Well, while there's some discussion generating here on the panel, why don't we ask those of you who wish to ask a question or make a comment, go to the two microphones here on the floor, and we'll intersperse your questions and comments with the comments that still may exist on the panel here.
Can I just make one observation?
Sure.
The other thing that Rudy was talking about was the dinosaurs, dinosaurs. There is clearly, and I sort of ask you to think about this. There is clearly an attitude, and maybe it's 12 years, and maybe it's just the vestiges of our caudillo system, but the Latino community, Hispanic community, there is this tendency to look for, the Hispanic in the White House or the Hispanic in whatever agency, sort of looking for the power brokers or the gatekeepers. And one of the most frustrating things I think that those sort of community activists are having is that for the first time, there is not a special assistant to the president for Hispanic affairs. There just isn't. There's issue liaison, but there isn't ethnic politics. So not only did the campaign sort of de-emphasize ethnic politics, it's carried over into the administration. The key there is, how does the White House in and of itself become integrated, and how the administration? But for the first time, people are, I mean, I can't tell you the number of people who are saying, well, wait a minute, who do we call in the White House to deal with Hispanic affairs? Well, no, if you want to talk about this issue, you call this person. If you want to talk to this person, you talk to this other person. So it's a different administration in that sense.
Well, I'm intrigued, if I could just throw this in, and maybe you could respond to this too, to what extent that reluctance to bestow ethnic responsibility on people in the White House is a kind of a sister soldier response to avoid scaring the majority community, and to what extent it's a new way of doing business in the White House.
Well, I was going to ask a question. There are rumors out there that, in fact, such a position was offered to a very prominent organizational leader from the Southwest in Texas. I don't want to go beyond that, but let me just say that those rumors are everywhere out there. You obviously don't want to talk about that.
No, I mean, I can tell you the rumors spread like wildfire around this country.
Does that mean that the rumor that I think we could, I mean, I was told,
I think
that
it's false.
That position has not been offered?
No,
That's
the
interesting.
position's never been offered. The Office of Public Liaison, which is where traditionally you had sort of, has been totally restructured.
Okay, that's very good to know.
I do want to say something, because it's sort of the exception of Florida again. One of the things that the Clinton, that fallover of Cuban politics is, with the Bush administration, they played Jeb and his family as the in to the White House. The Clinton administration came back with Maria Arias, Hillary's sister-in-law, who's a Cuban-American. So both campaigns sort of had, well, there's a family connection with the Miami community. And it was interesting because Miami was the exception as far as both campaigns playing the ethnic card.
I think that's true, because it wasn't really, certainly in the Southwest, I don't think anybody knew Maria Arias was in the family.
Well, let's go to the questions, and briefly identify yourselves, and let's try to keep the questions and the responses as brief as possible so we get everybody in.
Hi, my name is Enrique Gandarilla, and I'm from the Puerto Rican community. The feeling that I get is that, maybe you're not exactly saying this, but that assimilation is it's almost a better thing than saying, I'm Puerto Rican and I am here thinking about the Hispanic community, but also thinking about the Puerto Rican community. For instance, the Puerto Rican community at all has just been mentioned barely, and I think a reason for that is that Puerto Ricans in general tend to vote a lot less than, let's say, the Cuban community in Miami. So if they don't vote, Puerto Ricans don't get elected to office. If they're not elected to office, they're not in positions where they can set the agenda. And if they don't set the agenda, then their issues and concerns are not going to be addressed. If you look at the Puerto Rican community right now in this country, they represent the poorest of the poor. And as long as Puerto Ricans are not represented at all, their concerns and their issues are not going to be addressed. So I would rather say that even though assimilation in the long term may be the best thing for everyone, right now we have to emphasize our diversity and our differences, because the differences that exist are very real.
If I may, a couple points. I never meant to suggest assimilation is better than something else. That's not what I was trying to say. Two things. One is, for the first time in the Congress, you have 3 Puerto Rican Congress people. Indeed, 2 of them met with us this morning in personnel to talk about two things: the lack of Puerto Rican appointments, Nidia Velázquez and Luis Gutierrez, who are very vocal and very strong advocates, not just for their districts, but for the island, because the second thing they talked about was the need to pay attention to the substantive needs of Puerto Rico. For example, highest AIDS rate that is devastating the population, so that by voting and doing, for example, Nidia's race is, I think, a classic, beautiful example of someone not being scared off by $3 million war chest, and not being scared that there were 4 other Latinos or 5 other Latinos running, but just going out there, not doing real campaigning, getting out there, getting the votes, because ultimately that, the only thing that matters is what happens at the voting booth. So I think that without those elections, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. And lastly, I think if I sort of talked about sometimes our differences, it's out of a frustration that I feel personally, having worked on this campaign and sort of come to know a lot of where this community is, of sort of potential political power that is just not being channeled in more effective ways. And that always gets back to we should be stressing political participation at the grassroots level, at every level, in order to exercise what, in fact, we could have a much greater influence on the agenda of this country.
Here, right here.
Alex Rodriguez, alum, and I think, Rudy, you've opened a rather interesting box, as you usually do, and we've discussed things before, but 3 points and a question. Point 1, I have the same reaction that Maria had about, Latino participation if the vote doesn't matter. Betty and I were early Clinton supporters in Massachusetts, and we knew the vote wasn't going to matter in a primary. We knew Tsongas was going to win. But so, your theory also holds true for all the white folk in Massachusetts that voted for Clinton. Their vote didn't count. And they knew that when they went to the poll. You go to the poll wearing identities other than the one that is ethnic. We went as Democrats making choices within the party. That's point 1. Point 2 is, I think we have to accept the fact as ethnics, I as a Puerto Rican, others as Chicanos, that sometimes it's okay if somebody else figures out something about us before we do. And I've always said at the school to young folk, especially Latinos who have political aspirations, you got 17 shots right now in a Latino district. Somebody's already sitting there if you want to be a congressperson. You're not going to get that seat. It's going to turn very slowly. Puerto Rico became a state, you get 6 more shots. And then once somebody got it, you've only got 23 shots. And the rest of your life, you'll never be a congressperson. The only other way you got to do it is go someplace else. And if you go someplace else, you've got to start deciding whether you might show your father status, your academic status, your good American status, your knowledge status, before you start showing your ethnic status, because you're going to have to build coalitions. And I think maybe somebody understood within the Clinton political structure that there was something different happening out there. Thirdly, let me skip third and go to a question. I can go on too long on the third. Simply, and directed at all of you, what do you see as adverse in the political structure for people to continue maintaining that structural separation of ethnic, racial considerations? There's never been any backing away from playing to white considerations. It's very overt. What seems to be, the problem with playing to non-white considerations other than white backlash?
Let me try first, and then others may want to jump in. In my judgment, it is all too easy in the contemporary arena to make an argue of uniqueness rather than proportionality. What do I mean by that? To argue that we as X, we as Puerto Ricans, we as Mexicans, have a unique set of problems. The Puerto Ricans may have a unique set of problems because of the island and the status question. But living in New York City, if you move away from the island question, I'm not sure that Puerto Ricans have a unique set of problems at all. They have language issues. All kinds of immigrants have language issues. They have poverty issues. All kinds of people have poverty issues. And when you take the unique position, you impede conversation. And I think that becomes the impediment where we no longer but let me go further. We have structures out of the Voting Rights Act that allow the system to build on historic segregation and isolate ethnic officials so that they really have no capacity electorally to speak to non-ethnic officials. So that one can argue, for example, that one of the prices of increased representation because of single-member districts out of the VRA, Anglo officials can say, look, you're responsible for the Mexicans. I don't have any Mexicans in my district. No Mexican comes to talk to me. You deal with the Mexican. You've asked for exclusivity. You got it. I think that's one of the dilemmas now. So if you argue out of proportionality, that is, more Mexicans are poor than Anglos, so we have to deal with poverty, Anglos included, you might have a better conversation. I mean, that would be my response to that.
Yeah, I'll just throw in a couple of cents worth here, I guess. You know, when you talk about addressing issues and addressing them mainly to a white constituency, I think that the reality of it is, from the perspective of a conservative or Republican campaigner, we don't target by race. We target by ideology, and we target by issues. And wherever you might happen to fall on that spectrum, we're talking to you. And if we see an opportunity to leverage votes and bring them away from the other side by creating magnets and wedges in the process of doing that, we're absolutely going to do it. But the moment that you start to break it down into smaller and smaller and smaller constituent groups, whatever constituencies they might happen to be, believe me, small business comes knocking at the door a lot. Big business does, labor unions do, everybody does. But the bottom line is, at some point, you have to address the campaign to a broad enough cross-section of issues to where it makes sense to enough people, so that when they go out and vote, there's some commonality to the vote that they're all casting. So I would submit to you that there really isn't that much white backlash going on, or that much overt appealing to white voters. It's just what's important to America, what's important to most people in this country.
Nelson, you're up. Good evening. My name is Nelson Rainieri. I'm a second-year Master's in Public Administration student here. I'd like to ask two very brief questions, one to the academic side and one to the political side. First, I'd also like to make a very brief comment, actually an invitation. Last year we had Professor De La Garza and Ms. Echiveste here. This is the second year. I really would hope, especially to the community here, that you would come back and try to institutionalize your presence here, because it's really a shame if you're not here that these things don't get discussed in such a fair and civil manner. So get that out. I can't pay for that, but anyway. The first question is, as a young urban Cuban American, what is often in Miami called a yuca, anybody that knows Caribbean food.
Excellent restaurant, also.
Okay. I wonder if what Professor De La Garza had discussed in breaking down the demographics and seeing that there's a big difference between the Cuban community and the other Hispanic communities, if generationally, across generations, if that's going to change, if you're going to see more of an alignment or a fusion. And then the second question is, in last year's class led by Professor De La Garza, we discussed in detail, and we never really resolved, in my opinion, probably because it's a difficult issue, something that I was surprised to not hear discussed this evening, which was the role of the VRA, of the Voting Rights Act. And I was very curious to see how the two parties, especially with what Maria was discussing tonight, how I think Clinton really is a new Democrat, how does that fit within that paradigm?
Let me begin by, it's an intriguing question, and what you find is in the Cuban American community that younger Cubans tend to be more Republican than older Cubans, which is a real contradiction. In 1980, 49% of they counted Cuban Americans were Democrats, and only a third were Republicans. Reagan did a lot to mobilize and change parties. Today it's about 66% Republicans. Part of the reason comes back to what I'm saying is that if you're a young Cuban American in Miami and you're interested in going into politics and you have liberal views on women's issues, you have liberal views on health care, you have conservative views on Cuban foreign policy, you try to run on the Democratic Party, you'll probably lose in the primary, because there's not enough Cubans in the Democratic primary, and the Anglos will run a candidate against you and you'll get defeated. You run as a Republican, you win the primary, you win the general election. Lincoln Diaz-Balart, first race he ran was against Lewis Morris as a Democrat for state assembly, and he lost. He comes back, reincarnated as a Republican, and wins overwhelming margins. Jack Gordon, leader of the civil rights movement in Dade County, liberal Democrat, state senator. When he retired, one of the leaders of the Democratic Party said, "There is no future for Anglos in Dade County because of the Cubans." That's what the Democratic Party in Dade County has to overcome. And so young Cubans who want a political future in Dade County, it's a very pragmatic political act. They run as Republicans. And that's the real dilemma the Democratic Party faces. No bright young faces, no bright brown Hispanic faces.
See, that's not true, Justin. Another place, and it was interesting because in our personnel search there, San Diego, or down in California, if you're a up-and-coming Hispanic who wants to get elected down there, you have a better chance of getting elected to a city office or a state office if you're a Republican. And so it's just the pragmatic considerations. With respect to the Voting Rights Act, I think there's a very interesting phenomenon, and Rudy started to allude to this when he said that almost by having sort of single-member districts and you sort of put everyone in one district and so you can get an Hispanic in Congress or something like that. There are now several cases working their ways through court. One of them has also gone to the Supreme Court, where what in fact the Republican Party is using the redistricting Voting Rights Act by concentrating, particularly in the South and in places like New York, by concentrating what are traditional Democratic voters, i.e. minorities, in one district. You lessen the influence of the Democrats in other districts, thereby allowing or increasing the opportunity for Republicans to win those seats. So now you have this tension between a desire for sort of representation, but you may in fact be losing a balance and the opportunity for Democratic seats. And I think that's a tension that's really coming to a head, and I don't know how it's going to get solved.
I think one of the the case that I'm too familiar with, in the case of Florida, that was one of the real dilemmas, is that the Republican Party came up with a plan which was the plan that was adopted, which had 3 majority Afro-American seats and 2 majority Hispanic seats. The Democratic plan had 1 majority Afro-American seat. What this did is it split the black Democrats down the middle as different people lined up for the Republican plan. The net result was that the Florida delegation went from 9-8 Republican to 13-10 Republican, because these are the dilemmas you were saying.
This is fascinating discussion, but we do need to move along. We have only about 12, 13 minutes left, so let's shorten it up if we can. Yes, sir.
All right. Arthur Jemison, first year graduate student at MIT, urban planning. My question is particularly for Professor De La Garza, but everyone should feel free to answer. My question is about ethnic politics, for better or for worse. Black and Latino are curious because we're often used as sort of political instruments, political pawns, and we're often at the same time we have political preferences, so to speak. And I'm curious about in the survey that you did, how what you see as the future issues that Latinos are going to be used in forwarding or backwarding, if you want to say that, and what issues do you see as future issues for Latinos to vote around, particularly?
The most surprising result of our national survey is that no matter how we analyze the data, we find almost no ethnic dimension to the data. That is, that when we control economic characteristics, that Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans essentially look like Anglos in their preferences. What that really tells us is that although proportionately Mexicans and Puerto Ricans may favor a policy more than Anglos, it's because of an economic condition rather than an ethnic value. Now, 2 points to that is there is a clear Latino domestic agenda. It is around social policy that has to be described as liberal. Your point earlier about these are conservative people, there's no evidence of that. There really isn't evidence of that. When you think of religion, for example, this is the most religious country in the capitalist West. Let me still use that reference. Latinos signal religion as less important than Anglos do, despite the mythology, okay? So that Latinos are united around education policy, they're united around the role of the state in facilitating access to and providing health, education, jobs, etc. Those are their policies. We could get into a complicated explanation as to why that might be ethnic, but it doesn't take on an ethnic dimension.
Only reason I ask is because oftentimes, when it comes to issues like immigration or welfare, those are usually a lot of times code words about Latino people or about black people. And I'm just curious if that...
Latinos are terrible on immigration. You do not want to assume Latinos are pro-immigration. It's the worst assumption you can make. Okay? Don't do that.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Tomas Laralde. I'm a Kennedy School student in Tejano, and I went and I wanted to. All the California people are leaking, obviously. I wanted to ask a question. De la Garza mentioned the youth of Latinos, and I wonder what each party is doing to sort of try to bring in to their fold, and develop new leadership around a younger Latino population. What types of things are they doing? And a second question I would like to have the parties address about registration and what they're doing to register Latino voters.
We had during the campaign, talk about, different constituencies. We had someone working on the youth vote. One of the interesting things, and why I wasn't surprised when Dario said that the Republicans, there were young Republic Cubanos in Florida, is that in fact one of the things what the Republicans had done was very successfully attracted that 20 to 35 crowd. And it may have something to do, for example, with the fact that the struggles of the 60s and 70s led to the excesses of the 80s, and when people have a certain economic level, you become perhaps more conservative. So there are a lot of factors playing. So one very important thing that the party and Clinton did was recognize that you needed to go after the youth vote. And obviously during the campaign, and it's shown itself post-election, trying to find the media and the mediums to communicate with the youth. It was no accident that MTV was used. It was no accident that he was, right after the national service or wherever that speech was also interviewed on MTV. I think that the party will be focusing very much on increasing registration by such things as the motor voter bill. Sort of, you get your license, you also register. There's a real emphasis on trying to make it easier to register, so that in terms of leadership, however, speaking only as a Latina and not really focused on the party so much, is I think there is a tension between attracting young, bright people like yourselves to party politics. I think, personally, that the election of someone like Clinton has brought government and politics back onto the positive side of a positive career. I think that for many years, politics and government was something that you just didn't do if you were bright and intelligent. And so I think the new attitude is, I mean, am I wrong? I mean, Well, right,
He's over
this
it,
is
he's been
true.
doing politics, that's why he's embarrassed by that.
No, there is a real desire to have talented people come into party politics. So I think that there's going to be some efforts, but
Yeah, with respect to what the Republicans will do to try and attract youth vote or young Latinos, I think that what you'll see is we're going to be talking an awful lot about opportunity, and we're going to be talking an awful lot about ending dependency, never becoming dependent, not expanding government, and you know, you just have a basic choice that you're going to have to make at some point. I mean, you're young, you got your whole life in front of you, your future is there. What kind of opportunities do you want to be able to pursue?
Do you have any programs? I mean, one thing about talking, but I mean specific programs in place that would try to bring in people is what I was specifically talking about. I mean, do you have things that opportunities, not just about talking, but actual physical things that you can attract Latinos, young people, to get involved in politics, to the Republican Party? I mean,
Well, there are arms of the Republican Party that deal specifically with outreach to various groups. Yes, there are young people. Yes, there are Hispanic Republicans. I mean, there's federation. There's a whole slew of different Republican federations that work within those communities specifically to bring them into the party and get them involved in the party. Yeah, but ultimately, our attraction is going to be on growth policies, not so much on some other artificial means of bringing people into the party.
Hi, yeah, my name is Jose.
last question.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Jose Vincenti, and I'm from Boston. First thing, situation about what happened with the Republicans here in Massachusetts. I know when they were doing the new delegations to congressional seats, that's what happened. That the blacks and the Hispanics, in essence, had to join the Republicans because the Democrats were not willing to work to try to create a district where people of color could get elected. And what happened then? Now we have two Republicans. One of the things, I sit on a ward committee, Democratic ward committee in Boston, and I know when the campaign was running that I was somewhat upset at Bill Clinton by the way he ran a campaign that, quote unquote, as you said, de-emphasized race. But in essence, you know, it's like a misnomer. It's like using the word colorblind. And in essence, he did emphasize race because he emphasized the white population, you know, non-city population at the expense of the city and at the expense of people of color. And I know in talking to a lot of young people that are involved in politics or are interested, that in essence they're being turned off from the politics because they feel that you're an invisible population. We don't really need you. We don't need to discuss anything with you because you're not important, because you're not white. And I was concerned about that message being sent to so many young people by the Clinton administration and through his campaign.
well, I think that your frustration was echoed throughout the campaign by many, many people of color. It wasn't just Latinos who were upset. There were many African American communities feeling that this was a very different campaign than the traditional one. And yes, you run that risk of saying, well, you're not important. The only person who's important is the white suburban voter. And it is a very delicate balancing act. I think that by focusing on issues, as he tried to do and has done in the State of the Economy address, you'll see that, in fact, the issues that, I mean, you talked about it, what he's proposing is a very heavy stimulus and commitment to things that are very important to the urban environment, which is a code word in these days for minorities. So I think that the way that balance has worked is to focus on issues and thereby avoiding some of the problems of the past. But I certainly agree with you that it is a risk that has to be watched carefully. It's a balance that everyone seeks, you know. Are you an American? One likes to think that you can be both Latino and an American and that there's not some choice in there. You happen to be an American of Hispanic descent, committed to the political participation in this country's future and demanding an equal voice in that development. But how you make that happen is where we end up disagreeing.
Might be an excellent place to bring this to a close. Let me say that this has been a fascinating look at these preliminary results of your research into 1992. My understanding is that the Hispanic Policy Journal will be incorporating those results into the spring issue, so you get a chance to take a look at that. There's also some fascinating survey research out that Rudy was involved in that hopefully be available around the school on these issues.
Purchase the book.
Purchase the book.
It's out.
Buy the
Latino
book.
Voices.
We'll require it in a couple of classes. That's surefire. Let me ask you to join me in thanking our panelists and our co-sponsors for a really fine and fascinating